All right, folks. I'm Eli Willett. My internship was on hydrokinetics and fieldwork, and we primarily did testing on the Tanana River, which runs through central Alaska. So a quick overview. We're going to start off just with bottom line, talk a bit about research and the bigger picture and how the research is going to be applied, and then talk a bit about the methods that we used and any lessons that we learned before we conclude. So up front, the Tanana River test site is used to study hydrokinetic power and what role it may play in future power generation. The test site is located about an hour away from campus, right on the Tanana River in the village of Tanana. At the site, we deploy and run different rotors and other instruments that can measure and test the river's potential as a hydrokinetic energy source. So a few different goals that we had this summer. We started off with what's called SHARKS testing. It's a really awful acronym. Submarine hydrokinetic and riverine kilomegawatt systems. They just wanted it to sound cool, I guess. So the rotors that we brought in that week were developed by a company called Blade Runner Energy, which is located out of Oregon. And they built these really cool custom fiberglass rotors, which they attached to a torque cable. I have some pictures that I'll show. Only of their older rotors, because their newer ones are still, they're trying to keep them secret, not secret, but not super published. And then later this summer, we did some 5 kW rotor testing, which it's a rotor with large aluminum blades that sit vertically in the water. And it sits on its own raft behind the testing barge. And actually, I'll go back to the picture I had of the testing barge. You can see that's the 5 kW setup we had. The 5 kW is the one in the middle, the barge is the one on the left, and the fish trap is the one on the right. I'll talk about that later. So here are some pictures. Again, here's our Blade Runner rotor. You can see it's attached to a torque cable. Those are the two scientists from Blade Runner Energy that we worked with. And then in the other two pictures, we have the 5 kW rotor while it's out of the water and while it's in the water, while it's running. And you can see kind of from the GIF how fast that river is flowing. You can see how fast it just kind of goes along the sides of that raft there. So we also did a lot of surveying and data collection. We used multi-beam equipment to gather detailed models of the riverbed. We used something called an ACEP, acoustic Doppler current profiles, to measure how the river flows. And we also did some drone surveys with work from a graduate student. So the left two pictures are the ACPs deployed in the water. You can't really see what the bottom of it looks like, but it's a sensor. They use sound to kind of calculate the water velocity and depth and things like that. They're deployed in both on the barge, and we also had them on our other boat right there. And then on the right, we have our little computer setup inside the tent on the testing barge. You can see we have a bunch of different screens that show all sorts of different kinds of data. So the bigger picture, hydrokinetics is a branch of energy. It has huge potential in areas with fast moving water. The Tanana River itself usually flows between like 1.5 and 2 meters per second, which is pretty quick. It can get up to like really the pace of like walking pretty quickly. So that's a lot of water. That's a lot of potential for power. The research that we do is used to find the best methods and locations to install hydrokinetic turbines. And these can be used to help remote communities on Tanana, Yukon, and other rivers. So research methods, deployment was kind of the best way to start things off. So different things we deployed: the diverter to divert debris, testing barge, which is where we store all of our testing equipment and stuff like that. We have computers on there, a hydraulic system, all that kind of stuff. Blade Runner rotors, which are horizontal axis. We also had a shore-based raft, which didn't work out so well, but we're going to test more of that later this summer after I leave. And of course, the 5 kW rotor that I mentioned and the fish trap. So this first picture here, this is the way we deployed the barge, the raft, whatever you want to call it. We would hook up the back of a boat to it and push it upstream where we would connect to a mooring buoy. And that would sit on a line and it would just sit in the river, but we kind of had to watch for debris. And then this is the Blade Runner rotor while we're deploying it. This black generator housing was lowered via a hydraulic unit. And it's kind of out of the water here just so you can see what it looks like, but it would eventually sit under the water. They actually had sensors that could read how far it was sitting under the water and the angle and all that kind of stuff. And of course, the generator housing has gears that spin. There's a gearbox in there. I think it was like a 1 to 20 ratio. and that in turn generates power. And then behind all that is the fish trap that we use to collect fish that may have passed through the rotor to see if they've been injured or killed or anything like that. So here's another picture of the generator housing. You can see the cable just goes right underwater. So the turbine can sit at a good point. And that's what it looked like when it was fully lowered. And here we have, again, our 5 kW rotor with the fish trap right behind it. And that we would just hook on right to the back of the barge so you could just walk across and do anything you needed to do. So other research methods, we did a lot of data collection with, again, the Blade Runner rotors and the 5 kW rotor. I can't include too much data from the Blade Runner rotors because, again, they're trying to keep that quiet because they are, pretty new company and they get a lot of cool funding. So they don't want their competitors to know too much about what they're doing. But I will talk a bit about our multi-beam surveys and the 5 kW stuff that we did. So, whoops. So on the left, you have the result of some multi-beam surveys we did at the beginning of the summer. That measures the depth of the river. It gives us a really good model of what the riverbed looks like. So the dark blue is the deepest spots. You can see there's two kind of eddies on the left side there. And then the red, you can see a lot of the red on the right where there's a huge sandbar. So that just means it's super shallow or super deep. And on the right is just what it looked like from being on the boat. We have the two antenna, and then under the water was the actual multi-beam, which sat a few feet below the surface. And then more ways that we collected data. We had a bunch of wires that came out of the gearbox with the black generator housing, which gave us a ton of data from the Blade Runner rotors, which again, I'm not really sharing too much of. And then on the right, you have some more multi-beam data. That's what it looked like on the computer screen while we were actually doing the test. So that computer was on the boat, connected to the multi-beam while we were running the boat. And then this one on the bottom right here was actually done with a side scan. We were looking for stuff on the bottom of the river. And we got some really cool detailed images of that. It doesn't look super detailed in the picture because the brightness wasn't great, but we actually got a really cool model of what the bottom of the river looked like with that as well. And then here are two pictures from our 5 kW testing. You can see how much resistance and different load settings we used. So at 20 ohms of resistance and 11.457 amps, 224 volts, and then we had a certain amount of kilowatts. We never really got up to 5 kilowatts, just because I don't know if we had enough current or the right amount of resistance to do that with, but we changed resistance. This graph here shows resistance, so you can kind of see how we just incrementally brought it up to test what the voltage, the kilowatts, and all that stuff would look like as we increase the resistance. And there's a lot more data that I'm just not really have room for. So lessons learned. Most of my work this summer was done in the field where a lot of things can go wrong. Mainly, we had huge issues with the diverter. So we actually didn't have it deployed for our weeks of testing, which led to a lot of debris floating down because the diverter is meant to divert debris floating down the river. We had torque cable failure with sharks testing and some issues with the boat motor, etc. There was a lot of stuff. I'm not going to get into it all. And I gained a lot of knowledge about the process of testing equipment and gathering data, as well as a great experience of using different tools and instruments. So you can see our diverter here on the left is in the stage of us deploying it. There's me and Leo on the diverter right there. And it didn't take long for it to just nosedive straight down. It eventually went all the way underwater. We had to get it out. Not fun. And here's the torque cable. If you remember, the Blade Runner rotor was attached to a torque cable on the back of this black gearbox. And that actually snapped about halfway through Sharks Week. It heated up, and right at the connection where most, it's going to be the weakest, it just snapped off. So the Blade Runner actually lost their newest rotor because of that, which is why we had the side scan out to look at the bottom of the river, see if we could locate it. We really couldn't, unfortunately, but we do have more time this summer to look for it. But those were the two biggest issues we encountered this summer, were the loss of the diverter and the torque cable failure. So conclude real quick, projects this summer were relatively successful. I just talked about, the two biggest failures, but we gathered a ton of data, especially on the 5 kW testing, but still a lot of stuff with the Blade Runner rotors as well. We did get a lot of chances to run it in different conditions before they lost their new rotor, and we could test their old one as well a bit more. And we made a lot of improvements on the testing barge and around the site. We set up a ton of cool stuff, including a MET station, which measures weather condition, wind speed, stuff like that. Again, lost of Blade Runner's rotor. And a lot of the work was very interesting and always kept me on my feet. So it was a really fun summer. Really enjoyed this internship. Any questions? A lot of breath, sorry. Yes, Tana, sorry. I don't know about elsewhere. They're coming back next week to do more testing with us at the site. They are based out of Oregon though, so I think they probably have some testing done in Oregon. They have a really cool website. If you just look up Later Energy, they have a lot of cool stuff on there about what they do and what their purpose is. So look that up. I don't know a whole lot about it. So yes.
Are we able to get the diverter back?
We're working on that still. We had a welder come and do some repairs on it, and it's not looking like we'll get it back out this summer, but next year it should be working fine. So yeah. Yes.
How much does the riverbed change throughout the season?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was about how much the riverbed changes throughout the season, and honestly, it's quite a bit. This picture here, actually, that I have, this is from the first week that I was working at the site, and you can see the barge is literally up on the shore bank. The river level right here is probably almost a foot lower than what it would be about a week ago is when it was the highest. So it goes up and down a ton, and that means the current of the river goes up and down a ton. So when there's a lot of current, the sediment just keeps getting pushed down. So I don't know if it's a huge change, but it's definitely enough of that, you know, from year to year, it's going to change, which is why we do different tests every year. Anything else?
Thank you so
All right.
much. If you have more questions,